中国人民站起来了。
The Chinese people have stood up. What does a man do after his dream comes true? For the man on that balcony, this was that moment. His name was Mao Zedong. He was not born into power. He was born in 1893 in a village called Shattering in Hunan province, to a relatively prosperous peasant family. His father was a stern, hard-working man who saw little value in education beyond basic bookkeeping. But Mao was a rebellious and voracious reader. As a young man in the bustling city of Changsha, he devoured revolutionary texts and witnessed the chaos of the collapsing dynasty. His journey took him to Beijing, where he worked as a humble library assistant at Peking University, a job that gave him access to the Marxist ideas that would define his life. It was here that the peasant's son forged a new identity, a professional revolutionary. At age 55, his long, bloody revolution was over. A new China, the People's Republic, was born. He promised to heal a nation scarred by that century of humiliation. He promised to forge a new destiny. For many years, we communists have struggled for a cultural revolution, as well as for a political and economic revolution. And our aim is to build a new society and a new state for the Chinese nation. But here is the question that would define the next 20 years. When a revolutionary who has spent his life fighting enemies has no one left to fight, where does he turn his revolutionary fire? The answer, tragically, would be upon his own people. Mao's new state was a people's democratic dictatorship, where all power flowed from the top of the Communist Party. At its heart was the Politburo's Standing Committee, a small group of men who would shape the nation's destiny. Among them were the disciplined Liu Shaoqi and the pragmatic diplomat Zhou Enlai. And above them all was Mao, chairman, military leader, and ultimate authority. He was married to Jiang Qing, a former actress who was fiercely protective of her husband and dangerously ambitious herself. She would be a name to remember. The China Mao inherited was a wasteland, and its deepest wound was on the land itself. For centuries, a tiny fraction of the population, wealthy landlords, owned most of the farmland. Millions of peasants were tenants, forced to pay back-breaking rents that could reach over 70% of their harvest, trapping them in a cycle of eternal debt and poverty. This was the fuel of resentment that the communists had expertly harnessed for decades. The party's first major act was to unleash this resentment. They organized Speak Bitterness sessions in thousands of villages. These were not trials. They were carefully orchestrated political theater. Peasants were encouraged, even forced, to publicly accuse their landlords of past abuses. Humiliation turned to rage, and rage turned to violence. Landlords were beaten, tortured, and executed in mass public spectacles. While exact numbers are impossible to verify, credible estimates suggest that between 1 to 2 million people were killed. Over the next 3 years, approximately 40% of China's farmland, around 47 million hectares, was seized and redistributed to over 300 million peasants. For Mao, this was more than just economic policy. It was the ultimate act of revolution. He was not merely redistributing wealth, he was shattering the very foundation of old Chinese society, the gentry class that had ruled for 2,000 years. The landlord class's feudal and exploitative land ownership system must be gotten rid of, and a new land ownership system for the peasants must be created. This is a complete democratic revolution, not just about sharing out property. By placing the weapon of class hatred directly into the hands of the peasants, he bound them to his revolution with bonds of blood and land. He became their liberator. It was a brutal, bloody transaction. What do you think? Was this a necessary evil to build a new China, or a terrifying sign of the violence to come? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The old world was being shattered, piece by piece. The land now belonged to the peasants, but the question remained, for how long? The first great test for Mao's new China would come not from within, but from a frozen peninsula just across its border. After World War II, Korea was divided. In June 1950, North Korea's communist leader Kim Il-sung, with the approval of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, launched a full-scale invasion of the South, hoping to unify the peninsula by force. The United States, fearing the domino effect of communist expansion, led a UN force to defend South Korea. They didn't just stop the invasion, they pushed the North Korean army to the brink of collapse, advancing all the way to the Yalu River, China's border. For Mao, this was an existential threat. An American-backed unified Korea on his doorstep would be a dagger pointed at the industrial heart of Manchuria. Furthermore, as a new leader in the communist world, he felt a revolutionary duty to save a fellow communist state. Stalin, eager to see America tied down in Asia, strongly encouraged Chinese intervention. It is clear that the United States of America is presently distracted from Europe in the Far East. Does this not give us an advantage in the global balance of power? It undoubtedly does. Mao now faced an impossible choice. His nation was exhausted, but against the advice of many of his top commanders, he made a colossal gamble. In secret, he sent hundreds of thousands of people's volunteers into Korea. The Chinese intervention was a massive shock. Using human wave tactics, they slammed into the unprepared UN forces, pushing them back down the peninsula in a bloody retreat. After 3 years of brutal seesaw fighting and a horrific stalemate, a ceasefire was declared, leaving the border roughly where it had started. For Mao, the decision was a stunning success. He had saved North Korea, stood up to the world's greatest superpower, and solidified his rule at home by rallying the country against a common enemy. But the price was immense. Over 500,000 Chinese soldiers died, including Mao's own son. Mao had proven he was willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to secure his revolution. His power was now absolute, and he would soon turn that power inward. The Chinese entry into the Korean War in late 1950 marked a turning point, not just for the peninsula, but for an entire generation. What followed was a brutal, grinding conflict, and the costs were staggering. While official Chinese figures speak of roughly 390,000 total casualties, Western estimates often paint a far grimmer picture. Some historians suggest the true number of those killed or wounded could have soared to over 1 million. Thousands more were captured, young men thrust into a war that wasn't their own, many of whom never returned home. The true human cost of this conflict remains a point of historical debate. But one thing is clear. For China, the victory was bought with an immense and tragic toll. Fueled by Soviet expertise, China's first five-year plan was, on paper, a remarkable success. The numbers were staggering. For 5 straight years, from 1953 to 1957, the nation's gross domestic product grew by an average of 8.9% each year. Industrial output, the heart of the plan, skyrocketed by an astonishing 18% annually. With Soviet aid, a foundational heavy industry was forged in steel, energy, and machinery. Behind these numbers, a quiet revolution was completing its takeover of society. By the end of 1956, the transformation was nearly absolute. 96.3% of all peasant households had been organized into agricultural cooperatives. Over 90% of craftsmen were brought into similar state-controlled structures. Private industry and commerce were virtually eliminated. But for Mao, this wasn't enough. It was too slow, too Russian. He wanted a uniquely Chinese path to communism, a shortcut to paradise. In 1956, he seemed to open the door to new ideas with the 100 Flowers campaign. His slogan was an elegant line of poetry: "Let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend." He invited intellectuals to speak their minds. Was it a genuine call for debate or a clever trap? The answer came swiftly. When the criticism came, complaints about the party's power, the lack of freedom, and the slavish copying of the Soviet Union, Mao was enraged. These blooming flowers were quickly labeled poisonous weeds. An anti-rightist campaign was unleashed to crush all dissent. The number of victims was immense. The most common estimate states that around 550,000 people were labelled rightists and purged. However, some sources estimate the real number could be as high as 1 to 2 million. These victims were overwhelmingly intellectuals, the nation's best and brightest. They were professors, writers, doctors, and scientists. They were publicly shamed, sent to brutal labor camps, or executed. This created a massive loss of talent and expertise, a brain drain that would deeply damage the country's development for years to come. The man who enthusiastically carried out this purge was Deng Xiaoping. China had just silenced the very people it needed most for what was to come next. In 1958, with all opposition silenced, Mao unveiled his masterpiece, the Great Leap Forward. It was not just an economic plan, it was a national fever dream. Mao declared that China would overtake Britain in steel production in 15 years. To achieve this, the backyard furnace movement was launched. Millions of people, including peasants, were mobilized to produce steel using small, handmade furnaces. While official numbers claimed huge increases in production, most of this steel was extremely low quality and completely unusable. At the same time, the entire country was mobilized. Previous agricultural cooperatives were merged into about 26,000 gigantic people's communes across China. By December 1958, an incredible 99% of the rural population, that's 120 million families, was organized into these communes. Some were the size of small cities, with up to 100,000 people. Within the communes, the party controlled everything. Private property was abolished. People ate in communal canteens. Children were raised in state nurseries. The family unit itself was under attack. A critical part of this plan was the reallocation of labor. Millions of peasants were pulled away from farming to work on massive infrastructure projects and in the backyard furnaces. This created a severe labor shortage in agriculture, especially as men were prioritized for industrial work, leaving women and the elderly behind to tend the fields. At the same time, Mao launched a war on nature itself with the 4 Pests campaign. Sparrows were declared an enemy of the revolution for eating grain. The entire population was mobilized to kill them. The result? With no sparrows to eat them, insect populations exploded, devouring the crops. And this created the perfect storm for disaster. Although 1958 saw an initial increase in agricultural output, the disastrous policies were taking effect. The massive labor shortage led to a sharp drop in grain production. At the same time, local officials, under intense pressure, reported fake numbers, claiming huge harvests that didn't exist. This led directly to the Great Famine that followed. According to Western estimates, the number of deaths from starvation between 1959 and 1961 ranges from a staggering 15 million to 55 million people. Under incredible pressure, local officials began to lie about their harvests. The result was not a leap forward, but a fall into the abyss. A famine of unimaginable scale began to consume China. People were reported to be eating tree bark, leather, and mud. In the darkest corners of the famine, there were whispers, and then official reports of the ultimate taboo: cannibalism. The Great Leap Forward was not a policy failure, it was a Mao failure. He was its chief architect, its biggest cheerleader, and its most ruthless enforcer. When brave officials like Peng Dehuai dared to present him with the truth, Mao didn't just disagree, he purged them, creating a climate of fear where telling the truth was a political crime. His belief in the power of revolutionary will over objective reality, his intolerance for dissent, and his profound disconnect from the suffering of the peasants he claimed to champion, all of these converged to create one of the deadliest man-made famines in human history. Liu Shaoqi was the president and the person directly responsible for adjusting the economy after the disaster. At the 7,000 cadres conference in 1962, he gave a very blunt assessment. Our present situation is 3 parts natural disaster, 7 parts human error. Deng Xiaoping, after returning to power in the late 1970s, led China on the path of reform and opening up. He publicly admitted the mistakes of the previous period. The Great Leap Forward was a terrible mistake. It caused a great disaster for the people. Nikita Khrushchev, General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. What they are doing is making little houses to melt iron. That's not the way to communism. The Great Leap Forward stands as one of history's greatest man-made disasters. We'd like to hear your perspective on this immense loss of life in the comments. For any other leader, this would have been the end, but Mao was not any other leader. As China starved, its relationship with its only major ally was falling apart. This wasn't a sudden break, but a slow-motion earthquake that began in 1956. The new Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, gave a secret speech, a stunning attack on the legacy of his predecessor, Joseph Stalin, exposing his brutal crimes and his cult of personality. For Mao, this was a profound and personal betrayal. Stalin, in Mao's eyes, was the symbol of strong communist leadership. To attack Stalin was to attack the very system of absolute power that Mao himself was building in China. It questioned the legitimacy of leaders like him, but the split went deeper. Khrushchev began promoting a new policy: peaceful coexistence with the capitalist West. He argued that in a nuclear age, a final war between communism and capitalism was not inevitable and must be avoided. To Mao, a lifelong guerrilla warrior, this was heresy. He believed world revolution demanded constant struggle and armed conflict, not compromise. Underneath it all was a clash of egos and national pride. The Soviets saw themselves as the big brother of the communist world, the undisputed leader. Mao, leader of the most populous nation on earth, refused to be anyone's little brother. The tensions exploded into open hostility. The Soviets publicly criticized the Great Leap Forward as reckless and foolish. Mao, in turn, condemned the Soviets for going soft and betraying the revolution. The final, devastating blow came in 1960. As punishment for Mao's defiance, Khrushchev ordered the abrupt withdrawal of all 1,400 Soviet advisors and technicians from China, tearing up hundreds of industrial contracts and projects overnight. Inside China, the society that emerged from the famine was traumatized and tightly controlled. Even as the economy was being relaxed a little to allow recovery, the party's grip on people's daily lives became an iron fist. For city dwellers, life was dominated by the danwei, or work unit. Your danwei was not just your workplace. It was a mini-state that controlled every aspect of your existence. It assigned you housing, gave you ration coupons for food and cloth, and provided healthcare and education for your children. You needed permission from your danwei to get married, to have a child, or even to travel to another city. It was the ultimate tool of social surveillance. For peasants in the countryside, control came through the hukou, or household registration system. This system acted like an internal passport, tying every person to their official place of birth. It was designed to prevent the starving millions in the countryside from flooding into the cities, effectively creating a permanent divide between rural and urban citizens. This was a society exhausted by political campaigns and focused on survival. The ideological fever of the Great Leap Forward was gone, replaced by a quiet, weary population completely dependent on the state for their next meal. It was a nation held in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the next command from its leader. While society was held in this state of control, a quiet but intense power struggle was unfolding at the very top of the Communist Party. The disastrous Great Leap Forward had severely damaged Mao's prestige. For the first time, his authority was being questioned. This came to a head at a massive meeting in 1962, the 7,000 Cadres Conference. Here, State Chairman Liu Shaoqi gave a bold speech. While careful not to attack Mao directly, he attributed the famine to 70% man-made disaster and only 30% natural causes. In the context of Chinese politics, this was a stunning public rebuke of Mao's radical policies. With Mao sidelined from day-to-day management, Liu Shaoqi and the party's general secretary, Deng Xiaoping, took charge of the recovery. They were pragmatists, not ideologues. Their goal was simple: to get the country working again. They dismantled the large communes, restored private plots to farmers, and allowed free markets to return. Deng Xiaoping famously summed up their philosophy with a single phrase: "It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." What he meant was, it doesn't matter if a policy looks a little bit like capitalism, as long as it produces results and feeds the people. To Mao, this was a profound betrayal. He saw their practical policies as a surrender to capitalism, a revisionism that would destroy the soul of his revolution. From the sidelines, he began to plot his comeback. His first move was the socialist education movement in 1963, a campaign to reinstill class struggle in the countryside. But its real purpose was to begin clawing back political control from Liu and Deng. A Cold War was now simmering within the heart of the leadership. With the doors to Moscow and Washington slammed shut, Mao looked for new friends. He turned to the newly independent nations of Asia and Africa, positioning China as the true leader of the Third World, a powerful new force against both American imperialism and Soviet revisionism. This was diplomacy in action. Premier Zhou Enlai became China's face to the world, embarking on a major charm offensive. His most famous was a long tour across 10 African nations in 1963 and 1964, where he spoke of a shared history of suffering under colonialism and offered a Chinese model for development, free from the control of the superpowers. But China's new diplomacy also had a hard edge. In 1962, a long simmering border dispute with India exploded into a short, brutal war high in the Himalayas. The Chinese army launched a swift and decisive attack, achieving its military goals before declaring a surprise ceasefire and withdrawing. The war stunned the world and proved that China was willing and able to use military force to secure its borders on its own terms. This was a society exhausted by political campaigns and focused on survival. The ideological fever of the Great Leap Forward was gone, replaced by a quiet, weary population completely dependent on the state for their next meal. It was a nation held in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the next command from its leader. Mao's response to this isolation was a policy of defiant self-reliance. If the world would not help China, China would help itself. This strategy rested on two main pillars. The first pillar was the nuclear program. Mao saw the atomic bomb as the ultimate symbol of strength and the only real way to protect China's independence. The program had started in the mid-1950s with Soviet help, but when the Soviets left in the late 1950s, taking their experts and plans with them, Mao made a bold decision. China would build the bomb alone. Even as millions were suffering from famine during the Great Leap Forward, a huge part of the nation's budget was poured into this secret project. Then, on October 16, 1964, at a test site called Lop Nur, their efforts paid off. With this successful test, China became the world's fifth nuclear power. But China also declared a PUSUM, no first use policy, promising to only use the bomb in self-defense. Its goal was deterrence, not attack. The second pillar of Mao's self-reliance was to support global revolution. He wanted to compete with the Soviet Union for leadership of the world's communist movement. China began to export its own model of revolution, which focused on the role of peasants and guerrilla warfare. China provided military and financial aid to revolutionary movements and new governments across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, and Tanzania became key examples of its influence. Mao's theory was simple. The developing countries of the Third World could win their independence from imperialism using the same tactics as the Chinese Revolution. He promoted a united front against both America and the Soviet Union, with China as the leader. This wasn't just foreign policy, it was part of Mao's ideology. He saw China as the new center of the world revolution. In 1964, his policy of self-reliance bore its most dramatic fruit. China detonated its first atomic bomb. The peasant's son had given his nation the power to incinerate the world. But even the bomb could not hide the devastation of the Great Leap Forward. The catastrophe was so complete that Mao was forced into a rare retreat. At a major party conference in 1962, he made a public self-criticism. He retained his title as chairman, but he ceded day-to-day control of the economy to more pragmatic leaders, Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping. For the next few years, these men worked to undo the damage. They dismantled the large communes, restored private plots for farmers, and allowed free markets to reopen. And it worked. The economy began to recover. Food returned to the tables. But for Mao, this success was a profound threat. He saw these pragmatic policies as a betrayal of the revolution, a slide back towards the hated path of capitalism. He watched from the sidelines as the very men he had put in charge dismantled his vision, and he saw their growing popularity as a direct challenge to his own authority. His retreat was not an admission of defeat. It was a predator gathering its strength before the next attack. Mao's greatest fear was not a foreign invader. It was that his own revolution was losing its fire. He feared a new generation would grow soft, that his own party was becoming corrupt. Mao's next move would be his most devastating, unleashing a decade of chaos and terror. If you want to understand the story of the Cultural Revolution, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next episode. To reignite that fire, he would soon unleash a political and social storm that would make the Great Leap Forward look like a gentle breeze. He would call it the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, and it would be a war against China itself.